it goes without saying that anti-Semitism, just like any other form of discrimination, is a very vile trait. Myself, as a Muslim, as a human being, I find anti-Semitism just as bad as racism against blacks, against Irish. I grew up in this country where Irish were prevented from entering certain facilities, certain restaurants and cafes and the such. Travelers, and obviously we have now the trait of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is on par with all of those and any other form of discrimination. But the fact is that anti-Semitism over the past, I would suggest, particularly probably 8 to 10 years, has been so casually brandished about, to the extent that I fear that it's been absolutely devalued. Yeah. Basically, anyone who seems to disagree with various parties is easily accused of anti-Semitism and therefore justifiably either cancelled or eliminated or, probably even worse, losing their jobs, losing their careers and the such. And your book captures it perfectly, I think. That's weaponizing anti-Semitism. I think that really captures where we are today. That there are groups of particular interests that seem to use anti-Semitism against anyone who has a bad word to say about Israel or its policies or the such. So let me first of all start by commending the title, but then querying where that came from.
Yeah, well, credit where it's due. The title was actually the idea of my editor, the publisher at Colin Robinson at All Books. I wanted to call it something a bit more direct, but he took me down from it. But
what do you want to call it?
I wanted to call it A Very Israeli Coup, which is actually the last line of the book.
Interesting.
And I think his title is worked out. I mean, I always liked it, and it worked out really well as well, I think, because I really think it has hit a chord with the current moment, because that is what is happening in society. This book is, I mean, the subtitle mentions Jeremy Corbyn, and of course a lot of it is about Jeremy Corbyn, and more importantly, the movement behind Jeremy Corbyn, the kind of popular movements behind Jeremy Corbyn that were kind of sprung up with deeper and older roots, but sprung up in 2015 when he first ran for the leadership of the Labour Party. So, a lot of it has to do with Jeremy Corbyn, but it has far wider implications for British society, and I would suggest the world as well. So the title really came from the fact that it is a weapon, and it's being used as a weapon, and it's being used as a weapon by a state, which is the state of Israel, which is a foreign power which was hostile to Jeremy Corbyn. So, and the kind of socialist movement around him. And so the title really came from that, and it's
we're talking about Britain.
Yeah.
We're here in Britain.
Yeah.
So what leverage does the state of Israel have over how Jeremy Corbyn is treated by the media, by political party, by his own party for decades?
Yeah, I mean, it's
a party which, by the way, he made the biggest party in terms of numbers of members across all of Europe.
Yeah, yeah.
So what leverage does Israel have on all of that?
Well, the Israel has always had quite a lot of leverage in the Labour Party. So the Labour Party was, I mean, I get into this in the book, as you know, I get into the history of the Labour Party and how pro-Israel it was for large parts of its history, even before the State of Israel was founded on literally the mass graves of Palestinians in 1948. There was the Labour Party was in favour of the Balfour Declaration, for example. In 1945, shortly before Israel was founded. The Labour Party's policies, that was when Labour domestically was very left-wing. Labour, obviously, after the Second World War, founded the NHS, nationalised industries, and consolidated and built the modern welfare state, which has, been deconstructed during the neoliberal era. But at the same time, internationally, the Labour Party was a colonialist party. It ran the British Empire. It promoted and ran and increased the British Empire. It worked against liberation movements around the world. And so that included Palestine. It was in favour of the colonizers, which were European Zionists for the most part, who went to Palestine to take over Palestine. And so the Labour Party has always had this pro-empire, pro-Zionism, pro-Israel strain to it. Now that tendency was challenged over the years, long before Jeremy Corbyn. So, as the British left moved away from Israel, and it moved to increasingly anti-war positions, anti-imperialist policies, challenging racism, that inevitably meant that it was going to become more and more critical of Israel over the years, as it has done. And Jeremy Corbyn was on that tendency. He was he was part of the Palestine Solidarity movement, and so the Labour Party, he was on the left side of the Labour Party, and so the pro-Israel lobbyists in this country always considered him to be an enemy, because even though before he became the leader he was considered marginal to mainstream media, as it were, he was still an MP, even if he was a backbench MP, and even if he was a rebel against Tony Blair and so forth, which as he was. For the pro-Israel lobbyists, he was considered to be a challenge and somebody who was the threat of what they would perceive as a bad example, and that we would perceive as a good example.
I recall that even the chief of the Joint Staff of the Armed Forces basically coming out and saying that we wouldn't accept Jeremy Corbyn being Prime Minister of the country.
This was one of the most blatant
bizarre
things. Yeah. So
bizarre.
So after he became the leader of the Labour Party, so this is something I mentioned in the opening of my book, that when he became the leader of the Labour Party, there's basically a prospect of a democratic popular movement taking over the Labour Party, and the Sunday Times publishes a front page story in which it says a senior serving general in the army has said that if Jeremy Corbyn became the Prime Minister, as is obviously the goal if you're going to be the leader of the Labour Party, to be elected and become Prime Minister, if he'd managed to do that, there would be effectively a mutiny in the armed forces.
Oh my word.
So, it shows that there were a huge array of forces against Jeremy Corbyn.
You would be talking about Egypt. You'd be talking about some kangaroo state somewhere in, wherever.
Yeah, like
where the
Egypt.
army is waiting to mount a military coup as soon as someone is elected whom they don't like. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible.
That's what they were talking about. The reason I put that in the book, and I think it's so important, is because that's what they were talking about openly. That was an open threat.
Yeah.
The general wasn't named.
Yeah.
But clearly, the Sunday Times has these very serious sources. So that is an open threat. And so imagine what they were doing in private. We don't fully know what they were doing in private to work against Jeremy Corbyn and the movement behind him.
But clearly the cogs of the establishment, whether it be military or political or media-wise or the such, were working against Jeremy.
Absolutely.
It was an absolutely crescendos of a tide wave against him.
There was a lot. he faced really an uphill struggle. But this kind of...
And all of that, now, just to put things into perspective, all of that, because Jeremy Corbyn had, for as long as I recall, probably 35 years, had been, a stalwart of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign. It had nothing to do about, his position within British politics. It had very little to do with, his capacity to run the country, to emerge from a global crisis, to do all of these things. It had nothing to do. All that Jeremy had done to deserve this kind of incredibly orchestrated tidal wave from all corners surrounding him was the fact that he supported Palestinian rights.
Well, yeah, I mean, so there was... What happened was there was there was kind of an alliance against him. So when you have people like what I would call the deep state, in terms of by which I mean the permanent security and military apparatus, which has a huge amount of say in this country, as it does in other countries, like you mentioned Egypt. That's a good example how the Egyptian state, the Egyptian deep state, the security services, the military obviously overthrew the first elected president that Egypt had, and eventually killed him in custody, Morsi. So Egypt has a deep state. Turkey very notoriously has a deep state, but we don't like to talk about the fact that Britain also has a deep state. So it doesn't necessarily mean they control everything, but it means that MI5, MI6, the military establishment, has a huge amount of say in public affairs in this country. And they're not subject to any form of democratic accountability whatsoever. And for them, there was a huge array of issues why they wouldn't want Jeremy Corbyn in power. But this issue of Israel became the most useful weapon against Corbyn, and which is why I argue in the book that the state of Israel itself, and its lobby in this country, because they often act together, really became the most effective weapon against Jeremy Corbyn, and were in the end, they played a major role in his downfall, if not the most decisive role. I mean, I do think that if it hadn't been for this kind of weaponized anti-Semitism against Jeremy Corbyn, he would have become Prime Minister, certainly in 2017. And it's another question of whether or not he could have stayed in power. Yeah. That's another question. But I think that certainly without this weaponized anti-Semitism campaign, he would have become Prime Minister. So it's for the Israel lobby, the fact of his support for Palestinians was, you're absolutely right, was the only reason that it was definitely the primary reason that they were against him. That's their main concern. And often these kind of forces, when you talk about the Labour Party right and the pro-Israel lobby being allied together, often within the Labour Party, they were the same people. So you've got people like Luke Akehurst, who is notoriously on the Labour Party right, but he's also, as his day job, he runs an organisation called We Believe in Israel. So his decisions within the Labour Party, his work within the Labour Party, is not going to be unmotivated by that fact. It's clearly going to play a major role. And the most really dangerous and poisonous part of it all was the fact that quite often pro-Israel lobbyists would kind of avoid that fact. They would cover up that fact of of their role and their history in the pro-Israel lobby, and they would say that their concerns and their opposition to Corbyn was just motivated by anti-Semitism. That what he was doing was anti-Semitism. That his supporters were anti-Semitic, and that they were saying things that were prejudiced against Jews. And probably Jeremy Corbyn was, I would suggest, was one of the very first MPs, politicians who actually stood up for the rights of Jews when they were being, vilified by the establishment at the time.
in the early 70s and mid 70s.
Jeremy Corbyn is a long-standing anti-racist campaigner, and that's just the fact of the matter. And very often his critics were people who had actually, quite racist and reactionary views, and certainly pro-Israel views. So you have people like Margaret Hodge attacking him. One of his MPs, Margaret Hodge, Ruth Smeeth, Luciana Berger, and they all claim that Jeremy Corbyn was a racist and an anti-Semite and all these things, and that's why they were opposed to him. But actually, they'd all, in one way or another, worked to further the interests of the Israeli state in this country. It's just a fact. Margaret Hodge, she is a supporter, if you look on the website still now, of Labour Friends of Israel. They don't, technically, she's not a member because they don't have a formal membership. They have MPs who support them. She's one of their supporters. Ruth Smeeth actually worked professionally in the past for the Israel lobby, BICOM, the Britain-Israel Communication and Research Centre, pro-Israel lobbying group, funded by a scion of an Israeli arms dealer. And she also worked for the CST, which is also another pro-Israel group, with actually close ties to the Israeli state and even the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. And Luciana Berger as well also has long-standing links to the Israel lobby, including she previously worked for Labour Friends of Israel. So all these issues were, for someone who was on the other side of that, like Jeremy Corbyn, who was actually a patron of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, MPs who had actually worked for the Israel lobby, not just in the broadest sense of being somebody who was, in favour of Israeli policies and against Palestinians, and in favour of the Israeli state itself, supported its existence. That aside, they actually were close to the actual Israel lobby and worked for the Israel lobby, in some cases professionally. Of course, they're going to be opposed to Jeremy Corbyn. Yeah. And then because they know that Palestinian oppression and Israeli apartheid is not a popular cause in the country at large, they have to kind of elide that distinction and kind of distract from it. And the way to do that is to try and muddy the waters and say, well, this is anti-Semitism. Yeah. And the campaign, I would say, was quite successful in some regards.
Very vile.
Yeah.
Quite vile. I mean, we're talking here not about opposing opinions. We're talking about bulldozing through the interests of a foreign nation, of a foreign country, a foreign state. Yeah. Not something to do with anything to do with. I mean, the fact of the matter, and this is something that you allude to in your book in several occasions, the fact that it wasn't that there was an opposing opinion on Palestine or Israel to that of Jeremy Corbyn's. It was that basically the absolute ripping apart and shredding to bits the whole legacy of Jeremy Corbyn, who has been an MP for decades, and who has been elected time and time and time again by his constituency, and even some of his political adversaries would attest to the fact that he's one of the hardest working, if not the hardest working MP in the House of Commons. Yeah. So it's that. It's not just opposing a view. It's not just criticizing and saying, you have it absolutely wrong. Yeah. It's going beyond to absolutely destroying, someone. And we could also allude to, mention Ken Livingstone, for instance. Yeah. I mean, the treatment that he came for, someone, again, whom, if you were to talk about Labour over the course of the past 40, 50 years, along with Tony Benn and you have to mention someone like Ken Livingstone. Yeah. But by his own party, let alone by, the Conservatives or his political adversaries, by his own party, absolutely demolished and destructed. It's vile.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, actually, Anas. I'm glad you've made it, because you couldn't even debate these issues. This is the thing. You couldn't even have a discussion. You couldn't even have that discussion in the Labour Party. You couldn't even, even when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader, he wasn't in control of the party.
Yeah.
He's a very democratic person. Almost to a fault, I would say.
Yeah, he had Keir Starmer in his cabinet, for God's sake. Incredible.
Yeah. So even to the point of where people who were openly sabotaging him, he wasn't working against them. He didn't, he didn't prevent that in any way. And yet, so yes, it led to this circumstance where you couldn't have a debate within the Labour Party over the issue of Zionism, over the issue of Israel. It was and what is, and take for example the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It was widely opposed. It was widely opposed by Palestinians, by Palestinian solidarity groups, and ethnic and religious minority groups as well. A wide array of groups, as you know, opposed it because it was ostensibly a definition of anti-Semitism, but if you actually looked at the text and the supposed examples of anti-Semitism in it, the majority of those examples were actually all about Israel. It wasn't anything to do with protecting
Am I correct,
Jews.
by the way? Am I correct in recalling that one of the critics of the definition was the person who actually proposed or drafted the definition?
That's right.
Because he warned that this would be used as a tool to stifle free speech or the such. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. I believe it's Kenneth Roth, I think, is the name, and he was one of the people who came up with the drafting of this definition. But one of the most interesting things has come to light more recently, and my colleague at the Electronic Intifada, where most of my journalism is, my colleague Ali Abu Nama, he wrote an article about this recently, mentioning the findings of a book by an academic called Tony Lerman, who's an actual expert on anti-Semitism, and he's the founder of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, and in his book it mentions the fact that the definition this definition of anti-Semitism, which is actually not really. It's really, I've always called it Israel's chosen definition of anti-Semitism because it's really to protect Israel and criticism, to stop and prevent and chill free speech on criticism of Israel. In Tony Lerman's book, he mentions the fact that the study that came up with this definition in the first place was actually funded by the Mossad, which is Israel's foreign intelligence agency. Israel's CIA, effectively, which is has this reputation and notorious history of being very brutal assassination and torture agency. Kidnapped Mordecai Vanunu, for example, the nuclear whistleblower, and often assassinates Palestinian activists and freedom fighters and so forth. And yet, this is the same organization which is trying to push a kind of weaponized form of anti-Semitism, and yet in this country we're supposed to believe that it has nothing to do with Israel. It's this campaign of weaponized anti-Semitism has been so successful. And that's what I try and get forward in my book. And unfortunately, it is the case that the massive public attention and public disinformation campaign, I would say, against Jeremy Corbyn has now, because it ended up, as you mentioned and sort of alluded to, really deposing him from public life, really. Not only, was he defeated in the election, but he was kicked out of the Labour Party, and he's now going forward to the next election. He's not going to be the Labour Party MP, not going to be the Labour Party candidate for the MP. He's going to, if he runs in the election, he's going to have to run against the Labour Party. We'll see whether or not he does that. But that has been so successful, it's now gone on and expanded to other areas of public life. Yeah. So we see, the leader of the National Union of Students being kicked out.
Yeah.
David Miller one of the leading experts in the country on the pro-Israel lobby and Islamophobia and just how lobbying and propaganda works in general, was kicked out of his position at Bristol University, essentially for his opposition to Zionism.
Correct.
For the
And you know,
one more thing. Despite the fact that 2 independent investigations by barristers found that he was absolutely not guilty of anti-Semitism as his opponents.
I mean, and the 2 examples you give of the NEOS president, elected president, as well as David Miller. I mean, those 2 examples are something that concerns me personally. And we had a chat about this just before the show.
Yeah.
And that is that university campuses used to be, to a large extent, an arena where there are robust views being exchanged, there are ideas, there are debates, there are dialogue.
Even 10, 15 years ago, things have changed so much now.
You know, I recall a time across several years when there wasn't a week that would go by without me being invited to speak on many issues, but particularly about Palestine and Israel. I have to say that across the past probably 8 years, 9 years, I think 1 or maybe 2 invitations came through. And, you know, the posters needed to be worded in such a way, and it was such a slog trying to get it through so that basically the university wouldn't veto it.
Yeah.
And this is what concerns me, because young people today are being suffocated from engaging in debate, discussion, in, you know, having these robust exchanges of views and opinions, of talking about politics freely, of talking about ideology freely, of expressing themselves and such, and then coming to a realization of where they want to be on the spectrum of intellectualism. Or
and we can't even have the discussion now. This is the problem.
No, and that doesn't bode well for the entire country for the next. You know, for our future.
Yeah, this is exactly it. And this is why it's about much more than Jeremy Corbyn as an individual. It concerns more than socialists. It's about the public sphere in this country and in the West in general. You know, we see very similar tactics all over the Western world, the so-called democracies, which are becoming increasingly undemocratic. You know, we see similar things happening in the US, which, I mean, at least the US has the First Amendment. I mean, I would say things are worse here now than the United States.
Well, they are. I mean, we have a Palestinian originating congresswoman, for instance. We have, you know, a block of maybe a very few, a clutch of representatives and Congress people, but they're there, you know, and it's probably quite novel in the states of the United States that within the House, in Capitol Hill, you know, there is now calls for Palestinian rights, calls for even BDS and the such. That's happening. It's not happening over here.
Couldn't have it here.
And that in itself is quite remarkable. I mean, only you know, maybe 2005 when I was in the United States, and I was proposing maybe, you know, students should talk about, you know, Palestine and the such, and I was sort of whispered in my ear that's not something that we talk about. Please don't get us into trouble. And I thought, well, listen, in the UK we're having this fantastic debate about all of this, and people are exchanging ideas, and now it's the absolute reverse. It's the absolute reverse. In fact, I would go even further to say, someone I met, an Israeli, and he cheekily sort of asked me, he said, oh, so how is the discussion about Israel going on in the UK? And I told him what's happening. And he said, you know, it's funny. There's far more freedom in Israel about criticizing Israel than there seems to be in where you are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, you even in the liberal... I mean, ultimately it is a Zionist newspaper, Haaretz. Even in the liberal... Some of the things you would have in Haaretz, you could not have in The Guardian, for example, you know.
B'Tselem, who called Israel an apartheid state. An Israeli human rights organization.
They went even... I mean, I found that report really interesting. I mean, on one level, it's very late. And the same issue with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch coming to this conclusion a couple of years ago that the state of Israel is an apartheid state. On one level, it's very late because Palestinians have been saying that actually for decades. They've been literally saying it for decades. So there's a question there to me about within our so-called democratic Western societies and governments, why are Palestinians saying this? Why is that not considered to be just as good and as valid or even better than an Israeli or a Jewish person in the West saying it? There's a question there about that. So it's interesting. But on the other hand, at least they finally come around and they are saying it, so that it's progress, although it's slow progress. But the other interesting thing I found about that B'Tselem report was they went even further, and they called Israel a regime of Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea, which is quite an interesting way to put it. I mean, it's becoming so extreme in Britain that the Corbyn years, when Jeremy Corbyn first came in, I think we were all sort of hoping for this great opening up.
Yeah.
And I think that did happen, but only for a very short period. And then there was a massive backlash, and we've reached a stage now where things have become worse in a lot of ways.
Coming back to your book, in your introduction, you talk about this project being a 7-year project.
Yeah.
So basically, by that, and my maths isn't brilliant, so you started around the earlier years of Corbyn.
Yeah.
Around 2016. And you open up, the very first line is about Corbyn. And clearly you use the example of Jeremy Corbyn in order to make the bigger point. Because it is such a flagrant example. And it's an example that we don't need to go back in history in order to try to understand or unravel. It's something that happened in our midst.
And it's still happening now.
And it's still happening. The aftermath is, I mean, only a couple of weeks ago, Diane Abbott was expelled from the Labour Party. Again, another stalwart of the Labour movement.
Yeah.
So how do you think, I'm not going to say how do you hope, but how do you think the book will be received? I'm not talking about the critics, because obviously the backlash has already started. How do you think it will be received by people who really want to know what's happening?
Yeah, that's a good question. I started writing and reporting about it back in 2015, actually. It was when Jeremy Corbyn first was running for the leadership of the Labour Party in the summer of 2015. I started from then because the attacks on him started straight away from the pro-Israel lobby, from the Jewish Chronicle, and from his other sort of opponents in the pro-Israel lobby, essentially. And I talk about them in some detail in the book. And I knew that they were going to not let this issue go. They were going to hang on to it, and they were going to keep hammering the point home. And it was something that it was kind of it was a tiring task to keep reporting on it, because it was a kind of interminable story that never ended, and it's still not ended now. My great hope for the book is to spark a debate, really, about this issue and about the lessons that can be learned from the Corbyn years, because I think, one issue is that I don't think the British left, but in particular, has learned the lessons of it, that they haven't faced up to the fact of how defeated they've been by the issue, that, there was parts of the Labour Party left which basically decided upon that their response to these smears was going to be essentially capitulation and appeasement, and just sort of say, well, okay, what Ken Livingstone said, maybe it wasn't anti-Semitic, but it wasn't very diplomatic, and so therefore just forget about him and we just need to move on. Let's just, for the sake of argument, let's concede that point, say what Ken Livingstone said wasn't very diplomatic. I happen to disagree, but just for the sake of argument, let's say he wasn't very diplomatic. What you're saying then is he should have been kicked out of the Labour Party for not being very diplomatic. On what other issue would you possibly make that argument? It's bizarre to me. Like, this is, you know, the Ken Livingstone was an anti-racist at a time when the national newspapers were just openly racist. Absolutely. In a way that, I mean, look, some of the national...
An anti-Jew.
Yeah.
Not just racist, but anti-Jew.
Yeah.
That was a time when Ken Livingstone, Jeremy Corbyn, Tony Benn, and many, many others were campaigning on the streets for the rights and for the dignity and humanity of the Jewish community.
Yeah, yeah.
It's absolutely bizarre. I agree with you, absolutely. But can I ask you a question here? And this is in order to open up another line of discussion. What's so bad about Zionism? Why do you have a problem with Zionism?
Well, Zionism is the official ideology of the State of Israel. It's the ideology that says that European Jews should become... Number one, it says European Jews are not Europeans, really. They're actually, quote-unquote, Semites who are originally from the Middle East. That's not true, number one. That is actually racism. That's anti-Semitism. And that is something that anti-Semites and Zionists both agree on, that actually European Jews shouldn't stay in Europe. They should become settlers in Palestine. And so that's one reason I have a problem with Zionism. Zionism is actually anti-Semitic. But the main reason I have a problem with Zionism is that it says that the indigenous people of Palestine, the Palestinians, who are all religions, including Jewish, a minority of Palestinians are Jewish, but Muslims, Christians, and everybody else Palestinian, should not be entitled to live on their land and should be essentially driven off their land simply because they're not Jewish, that only Jews have a right to live on that land, essentially. And that, in a nutshell, is the problem with Zionism. It's a settler colonial movement in a very similar way that to the white supremacist ideology of South Africa and the so-called Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. Yeah. It's a colonial movement in a very similar way to a lot of other settler colonial movements that were promoted under the British Empire and other empires.
Australia, the United States, South Africa, to name but a few. And they were hoping for the same in Palestine.
Yeah, and so they were partially successful in they wanted to remove the indigenous population from the land, and they were only partially successful in 1948 in removing around 800,000 Palestinians by force from the land, and they then became refugees, and they still have never been allowed to return to their land in Palestine. Again, purely and simply because they are not Jewish. And so because Zionism promotes a regime in the historic land of Palestine between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, which, as we mentioned, the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem now calls a regime of Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea, that Palestinians remaining in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip have no rights. They have no political rights. They have no human rights. They have no right to live on their land. They can be displaced and driven off their land at any time. Palestinian villages are being destroyed and depopulated by the military occupation, the Israeli military occupation. And so, I've lived in the West Bank. I lived there for about 2 years, and I've seen it with my own eyes. Like, Palestinians are discriminated against. The other thing that these human rights groups, including B'Tselem, as we mentioned, say is that Israel is an apartheid state because, very similar to apartheid South Africa, and again, Rhodesia, the former Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe, when it was a white supremacist regime, they had one set of laws for the white settler population and another set of laws, effectively a military regime for the indigenous people. And so it's very similar in Palestine. Palestinians living in the West Bank, remaining in the West Bank, who've managed to hold on barely to living in their land, although they don't have any political or human rights. If they've managed to stay on their land, they are subjected to military law, whereas the Israeli settlers living in the West Bank, especially in places like Hebron, where there's a really extreme and open form of Israeli apartheid. They are not subjected to military laws.
Yeah.
They have civilian courts. And so, there is literally two separate sets of laws for the settler population and the indigenous population. And the ideology behind all of this is Zionism, calls itself Zionism, and that is why I have a problem with Zionism.
And lest we forget, up until recently, in my living memory, Zionism was classified as a hate ideology, even by the United Nations. It was globally recognized as a hate-fueling ideology.
Yeah, the United Nations for a period did recognize that Zionism is racism. So there's a very that was later overturned at the behest of the Americans. But the United Nations is an interesting body because it was the United Nations that was partly responsible for the partition of Palestine. Yes. And therefore, by extension, for the displacement of partially responsible for the displacement of the Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948. But what's crucial to remember, and I think a lot of people forget or don't know, is that at that time in 1948, that was before decolonization, and there were so many nations in Africa, in Asia, around the world that had not yet had their independence, and so the actual it meant that essentially Britain and America and the Western colonial nations, the imperial nations, had more control and more say in the United Nations at the time, which was why the partition of Palestine was kind of approved at the time. Later on, in the 70s, after there was successful decolonization movements around the world, and there were more independent nations, there were obviously, even the governments were far more sympathetic to the Palestinian liberation struggle, and that is when the period came that United Nations General Assembly recognized the fact that Zionism is racism. And so, that is something that I still think is accurate now.
The issue of Palestine is of global impact, and it's I think it's actually the longest running conflict or issue that the world has failed to resolve. And wherever you go, the issue of Palestine is heard. Now, it's uplifting when wherever there's a march or protest or the remembrance of, for instance, the Nakba, where you go and see countless young people, men and women, carrying the Palestinian flag, and identifying the Palestinian kufiya, for instance, and that is extremely uplifting. But it has become, for a while now probably, but now even more so, it's become a defining element or issue of the left, the political left. I'm not entirely sure whether that's in the best interest of the Palestinian cause. It's fine that the left stand favorably, let's say, with Palestinian rights, either support absolutely or, mildly, but still but the fact that it's outside of the left, you have virtually no support for Palestinian rights. At least in our country, at least here in the UK, I'm not entirely sure whether that's in the best interest of the cause itself.
Well, the way I see it is that it's a decolonial issue. And so, I think polling shows that even in the United States now, that there is broad support among the populations in general, for the Palestinians. Yeah. For Palestinians because look, when you're arguing for Zionism, at the end of the day, you are arguing for
colonialism.
You are arguing for colonialism, and you're arguing for apartheid. You're arguing for the idea that Palestinians shouldn't be equal to Jews who live in the land of Palestine, the historic land of Palestine. And so ultimately, in the modern era, that is just not going to be popular in any way, and I think except amongst just ardent racists, essentially. And that is why the Israel lobby, the state of Israel as well, has to kind of do things behind closed doors and do these kind of narrowing of the space and this kind of weaponizing of anti-Semitism and stopping the discussion from happening because they know they can't win the discussion in any kind of open debate. And so I think if I take hope from anything, it is from just seeing that there is change among the populations, among young people, among even the Democratic Party in the United States, and in terms of its voter base, not in the leadership, the elected leadership, and not among the lawmakers, except as you mentioned, amongst some of the more progressive lawmakers and so forth. But it's becoming, I think, I agree with you in the sense that we want to broaden out the issue as much as possible. Yeah. And I think that is happening, that kind of change is happening when you look at it in a historical context. And, even the left, even the British left, as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, historically was actually quite pro-Israel.
Yeah.
And so that has changed. Yeah. And so I think it needs to change in the whole of society.
You talk about the left. In reality, what's left of the left?
Yeah, not much. I think the British left has been defeated for a generation. I don't see any hope for it. Basically, I know that sounds quite despairing, but that is what the weaponizing of anti-Semitism has done and what this issue has done. The manufactured anti-Semitism campaign against Jeremy Corbyn was so successful that it's gone, as we mentioned, it's gone to all sectors of society. It's made it very, very hard to even talk about, it's made it hard to talk about any kind of progressive change in the country, about the Palestine solidarity, about the issue of Palestine in general. And it's just made it so that free speech in general is just very, very chilled, and it's kind of a bleak picture. On the other hand, when the Jeremy Corbyn movement did happen, nobody saw that coming. So something new could happen.
Yeah.
And maybe we just don't see it. But for the moment, things do look very bleak.
The Labour Party. It's unfortunate that we're seeing a recycling of the Blair model.
Yeah.
But with far less charisma, I would suggest, with Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
He is reaching. But polls, if we're to believe polls, I'm not entirely sure whether we should, but if we're to believe polls, then if an election happened tomorrow, the nation would vote Labour in. But Labour that seems to have done away with most of what made Labour.
Yeah.
The last thing, besides obviously the stalwarts of the Labour Party of the past 30, 40 years, but even policies such as tuition fees and the such. It seems that Keir Starmer has absolutely surrendered to right-wing policies that, we're not going to touch those. We're not going to campaign for students anymore. We're not going to. So, let's go with those hypotheticals of the polls and assume that Labour came into power, tomorrow, next week, or whatever. What are we likely to see?
I think things would get a lot worse on this issue, and I think that we would see a very empowered, oppressive state. I think that. The Labour Party under Tony Blair was very pro-war, and it was also quite authoritarian. And I think the way that Keir Starmer has acted as the leader of the Labour Party, number one, he's been incredibly dishonest. So he campaigned to be amongst the membership to be the leader of the Labour Party, and when he did that, what he claimed that was he was going to be Jeremy Corbyn's policies, but in a more charismatic style. And he made these pledges to that effect. And he has abandoned all those pledges, and he's upturned. One of the things that he said that he would do would be to be a broad church in the party. Well, what's he done? He's purged the party.
Exactly.
200,000 members have been driven out or left in despair because they're from the pro-Corbyn tendency. And I think that shows that there's a real concern there to me when if Keir Starmer was to get into government, that he would act in a very similar way in government. And to me, it shows that if he's acting in that way in opposition, there's absolutely no reason to believe he'll be any other way but dishonest in government. And it's incredibly concerning to me. I think the polling, again, you never know what polls to believe. When there's an election, then they're very likely to narrow, especially if the Conservative government comes around in any way to uniting around its leader, which doesn't look very likely at the moment. That's a given. But what I would say is polling does also show that there's a large constituency in the country which wants a new party to take on both Labour and the Conservatives. Someone like Jeremy Corbyn, if he had the political will to do it, could lead that party. Yes, we don't have a proportional representation system, so it makes it incredibly hard for a third party. But I think that if there is to be any kind of progressive change in the country, then that needs to happen. And, there is a massive constituency out there for it, because there's a great amount of despair, I think, in the country in general,
True. Back to your book. How well has it been received? It's early days, but how well do you think it's been received?
Yeah, it's going well so far. The publisher's very happy with it. I've had several positive reviews.
Invited to do promotional events?
Yeah. I've had I can't keep up with them at the moment. There's a lot of activists and several bookshops who want to put on an event about it, and so we'll be announcing those in the coming days and weeks, and hopefully doing a bit of a tour around the country to talk about it. And there's been only one negative review from the Jewish Chronicle, which which I'm surprised they reviewed it, to be honest. I thought they would do the usual.
Yeah, you think that they wouldn't really bring it up.
I thought they would sort of try and ignore it, basically, but I think they thought they would get a hatchet job in first. And the review is interesting because it is a hatchet job, but she does say that it reads like a political thriller. It reads like a whodunnit, which is
fantastic.
Which is what I was going.
Fantastic.
For. So
I'm now driven even further to get hold of.
Yeah, I mean, I try to write in an engaging style and not an academic.
But listen, from what you get, from the kind of feedback from the people that you meet, from the events that you attend, do you get a sense of optimism in regards with the issue of Palestine? I have to say, I mean, not to preempt your question, but I have to say that I am incredibly hopeful. I mean, the marches, the rallies, the events, and the young faces that I see all around me is something that fills my heart with hope. Yeah, not sure about you.
I agree. When I see the chilling of free speech, the things that you describe, how it's so hard now to get on an on-campus event about Palestine, it has to be vetted, and your speakers have to be always challenged, and the administration has to have a say. It is so difficult. I find that very, very difficult and quite pressing at times. But I agree with you when you just see generation after generation and the young people who turn up at events and rallies, and the popular support there is for the Palestinian people, even amongst people who don't necessarily understand all the ins and outs of history and all the way that the Israel lobby works and operates. People get it on an instinctual level that this is oppression and it needs to be opposed, and that we can unite to do that. And so that does give me a great amount of hope when I see things like that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.